Welcome to my studio. I'm Sasha Starlight. I make all my own clothes and I show you how to make yours too. Today I have a pattern and a sewing tutorial for you, and I'm going to show you how to make a vintage blanket like this into a coat like this. If you'd like to sew along, you can download the pattern on my Etsy store and I'll pop the link down below. So this is a design that I made for my own label last year. It's one of the most popular styles, but it's really accessible and it's suitable for beginners. The only thing that you do need to have is a machine that's capable of sewing heavyweight fabric, because the blankets that we're going to be putting through it are quite chunky. So you just want to make sure that your machine is able to handle 2 layers of that. I'm going to be showing you 2 versions. So one in a smaller blanket, this rainbow check here, which also has tassels, which is really cute, and also a larger blanket in these primary colours here with a blanket stitch at the edge. The reason I'm going to do 2 versions is because this is quite a non-traditional pattern. So the really nice thing about it is that it really takes on the character of the original blanket that you're using. Which takes me on to an important note before we get started. As this pattern is designed to work with reclaimed blankets of different shapes and sizes, it works a little differently to the sewing patterns you may be used to. So to get the most out of the pattern and tutorial, I advise taking note of the following tips before you start. Number 1, the cutting part of this project is actually the most challenging. It's the longest part of the tutorial, and it's where you'll need to make independent choices based on the features of your individual blanket. So I advise watching the whole tutorial through before you get started to get a feel for the options from my 2 blanket examples. Steps 1, 4 and 9 cover blanket variations, so pay close attention here and watch a couple of times if you need to. Step 1, choose blanket. Let's take a closer look at our coat and talk about our blanket choices. All the examples that I have here are woolen blankets, but you can also use a patchwork or a quilted blanket if you'd rather. I think that'd look so cute. The main thing that you need to bear in mind when you're choosing your blanket is how big it is. So the size of the blanket, it will determine the finished size of the coat, but there is a minimum that you need to stick to. So if you're going to make up the pattern in the smaller size, then your blanket needs to be at least 50 inches on the smaller side of the blanket. If you're going to make up the coat in the larger size, then your blanket needs to be at least 60 inches across its narrowest side. If you have a look at the coat that I've got on the stand here, I'm going to show you where the width and the length determines the overall size of the jacket. If you have a little look at the collar, so it's a simple shawl collar going around. So in this version, it's about 62 inches, and that length for the collar is determined by the longer side of the blanket. So for example, the blanket that I have here, the first one, rainbow check with tassels, is about 53 by about 58 inches around. So the collar will end up being about 58 inches. And if you have a stand, it's really helpful for this part because you can actually get your blanket onto the stand and fold it in such a way so it will give you kind of a rough idea of what your finished coat is going to look like. First of all, I'm going to have a little look at the features that we have. So this one's got these fab tassels, so I feel like I definitely want these to be on the collar. And you'll see the collar, it's about 3 inches deep. So I'm going to fold my blanket about 3 inches across the top. You don't need to be super precise on this bit, just a rough approximation. And I'm just going to drape it over the top to get an idea of what it's going to look like. Then what I'm checking basically, because this is a smaller blanket, is how long it's going to be at the front. So these jackets, they always come out a little bit shorter at the front. That's part of the style of it. Looking on the mannequin, you'll see we've got that red line across which marks the waist. and the front's falling just below the waist, which I really like. So I think this will be a perfect blanket coat for that kind of transitional weather from when it's still slightly chilly and you want to be like warmer in the evenings. I think this is going to be perfect for that. Let's turn it around now. And then we're going to have a look at the length of the back of the coat. So the length of the coat is determined by the shorter side of the blanket. And from that, we need to subtract about 25 inches from the bottom. Just got to lift that up so you can see. If I measure my tape measure about 25 inches up, it takes us to about here, which is about hip length. And again, I think that looks good for the type of jacket that I want for this time of year. The reason that we take that 25 inches off the bottom is that is the part of the fabric that we're going to use to cut the sleeves. So let's try with my second blanket. So my second blanket is larger, so this will make a bigger coat. This one would be suitable if you needed to make the larger size on the pattern. Holding the blanket up, that longer side is going to be the collar. And I'm going to fold that over, again, about the 3 inches. Let's drape this around my stand. So you can see the front of this jacket will come out a lot longer than that last example that I was showing you. So this one, looking at the mannequin, who is about the same height as me, it's going to come up to kind of mid-thigh. So this is great for a warmer jacket, great for the colder months as well, this one. It's also a slightly thicker wool, so I think it's going to be really luxurious. And we can see this one's going to be really lovely with that kind of two-tone back there. And that's a really great thing about this design as well, is that each time it comes out completely different and it really takes on the characteristics of the blanket, which is super exciting. So I'm going to measure from the bottom, that 25 inches for our sleeve, and then we've got a nice long length there at the back as well. So to recap, to make the coat in size small, your blanket needs to be at least 50 inches on the smallest side. For the large size, it needs to be at least 60 inches. The longer side can be any length above the minimum and will run along the collar of your coat. The bigger your blanket, the longer your coat will be. 25 inches of the blanket is used to make up the sleeves and pockets as shown in the diagram. So to work out the approximate length of your coat before you start, subtract 25 inches from the measurement of the smaller side of your blanket. That seems good to me. Let's jump onto the table and start working with the pattern. Step 2. Assemble sewing pattern. First, print out your pattern, being careful to print at 100% scale and checking the scale guide on the first page against your tape measure to be sure. Next, cut each page along the purple boundary lines as needed and stick the tiles together with tape or glue using the tile map in the instructions as a guide. Next, cut each pattern piece along your chosen size, taking extra care with the armhole, and you'll have 3 pieces in total: main body, sleeve and pocket. And finally, punch out the marked holes. There's 1 on the sleeve and 3 on the main body to mark the pocket position. Step 3. Iron blanket. If you're using a wool blanket, it's really important to give it a good iron first with plenty of steam. We'll be using the iron throughout the process to press our seams and shape the garment. The heat and the steam from the iron can shrink the wool slightly, so we want to make sure that happens evenly across the whole piece before we start sewing. If you're using a quilted blanket, this stage won't be necessary. Step 4. Cut blanket coat pieces. Lay the blanket on the table or floor and fold it in half, with the right side facing out, allowing you to see any imperfections on the blanket you may want to avoid, and making it easier to mark the position of the pockets. The folded edge will run down the centre back of the coat and will be the shorter side of the blanket. The edge to the left, where my blanket has the tassels, is the part of the blanket you want to form the collar of the coat and will be the longer side of your blanket. Lay the main body piece of the pattern onto the fabric. If you are keeping a feature of the blanket to use on the collar, like I am with the tassels, you will need to fold the pattern along the line marked as the collar hem, as you won't need seam allowance in this area. Make sure to fold at the right line for your size. Then place your pattern piece with the collar side matching the left edge of the blanket and the centre backline along the folded edge. As we're using a reclaimed vintage textile, the edges might not be completely straight, as you can see here with mine. If that's the case, match the pattern up as best you can and pin the piece into place. Next, take your sleeve pattern. You can roll up the pinned side of your blanket if you need to create more space on your table, and decide the best placement based on the features of your blanket. I'm going to cut mine this way round so the tassels hang from the sleeve cuff, and it's fine to use either straight or cross grain for the placement of this piece. Because I'm using the tassels at the sleeve edge, I'm going to fold the pattern along the sleeve hemline to remove the seam allowance, just like I did on the collar of the main piece. Place in position but don't pin yet, and repeat the process of finding the best placement position for your pocket piece. I'm going to make use of the tassels again by having the hem of my pocket folded outwards to let the tassels hang downwards. So in this case, I will leave the pocket hem unfolded. When you're happy with your placements, pin both the sleeve and pocket pieces into place and cut them out, making sure to leave any original features that you're using intact. Use long strokes and rest the bottom of your scissors on the table for more stability. Mark your notches on each piece. I use a small dashed line to indicate the notches on my patterns, and I prefer to mark them using a small snip into the fabric, using just the tip of my scissors. Next, mark the end of the dart by placing a pin through the punch hole, then unpinning the top of the pattern piece so you can carefully pull the two pieces apart, and mark the position of the pin with chalk on the inside of each piece. Unpin the pattern, and if the front and back of your blanket are really similar, like mine, it's a good idea to mark the reverse of each piece with a chalk cross to keep things clear and avoid mistakes as you move through the sewing process. Unpin your pocket piece and mark the reverse with a cross if you need to. Unroll the rest of your blanket to reveal the main body piece. Most importantly now, take note of the parts of the pattern marked with do not cut fabric here. This is because this side of the blanket will remain intact to form the front of the coat and will simply extend here to the full width of your individual blanket. First, we're going to mark the bottom edge of our coat, where it says continue to length of blanket on the pattern, and you want to make it as long as you can with the blanket that you have left by marking a straight line exactly parallel to the bottom of the pattern. Start by measuring from the top of where you cut out the sleeve and mark the longest point you can go with a chalk. Then repeat that process with the same measurement all along the bottom of the pattern piece, making a dashed line with the chalk as you go. If your blanket doesn't have a bold geometric print, you can cut both layers together at this point, along the dotted line. Because I have a bold check pattern on this blanket, I'm going to cut the top layer of the fabric only. This is so I can make sure my hemline is even to the check pattern on both sides. By flipping the blanket over and measuring an equal distance from the bottom check line on the reverse side, marking with a dashed chalk line, then continuing to cut along the piece with your scissors. Next, cut out the armhole by making a hole in the middle first, then trimming close to the edge of the paper pattern and marking the notches around the armhole. These are the only notches on this piece, and they're the most important as they will help us put in the sleeves at just the right angle later on. Finally, mark through the punch holes with chalk to mark the pocket position. Then put a pin through each and flip the blanket to mark on the other side, using the pins as your guide, and unpin the pattern piece. As the cutting process can vary quite a lot depending on your blanket, I'm going to show you the whole process again on my second blanket so you can get a better feel for the variations. Again, I have folded my blanket so the longer side is at the two far edges and the shorter side runs along the fold. I'm going to place my sleeve piece first this time, and I'm going to make use of this nice blanket stitch to form the edge of the sleeve hem. I've placed it right up to the edge of the blanket to make the best use of the fabric before pinning into place. Now I'm going to place my pocket piece. It would be nice to use the blanket stitch at the top of the pocket, but I can see that would be really wasteful of the fabric when we have such a big section available here, and I'd like to make this version of the coat as long as I can. So I'm going to place the pocket piece here with the hemline unfolded. I think it would be nice to have this line running directly through the centre of the pocket, so I'm going to fold the piece in half and line it up before pinning into place. This time I'm going to cut out both my pocket and my sleeve piece before moving on to pin and cut the main body and add the notches and chalk mark for the end of the dart as before. This blanket also looks very similar on both sides, so again I'm going to mark the wrong side of the fabric with a chalk cross to make things clearer for the sewing process. Now let's see what we've got left to cut our main body piece. The basic shape of the main body of the coat is a large even rectangle of fabric. So this time, to make it a little bit easier to visualise, I'm going to start by cutting the remaining part of my blanket into an even rectangular shape. As I have this bold geometric design, I'm going to use the lines of the pattern to help as a guide and measure evenly from this line on the right. If your blanket doesn't have a pattern like this, maybe it's plain or floral for example, you can measure your rectangle evenly from the finished edge on the left instead. Mark your new edge the whole way along the piece with a dashed chalk line, marking on both sides of the cloth, then cut through the dashed line in a single layer. Fold your blanket in half again, bringing the two shorter sides of the rectangle to match, and decide which side of the rectangle you want to use for the coat collar. I think this small diamond motif will work really well on mine. Now take your main body pattern piece and lay the edge marked as the collar hem against the side you've chosen to form your collar. If this edge is the line that you've just cut with your scissors, then leave the pattern piece unfolded as I'm doing here, as we will need the seam allowance this time to finish the raw edge later on. Pin the pattern into place with the collar edge flush to your chosen side and the centre back line against the fold. Mark your pocket position through the punch holes with chalk as before, remembering to mark both the front and the reverse. Then the only thing left to cut for this piece is the armhole. As before, we are not cutting around the outer edge of this pattern piece, as this is a zero waist pattern and the size of your original blanket and the straight line we've just cut will determine all the other edges. Finally, mark your armhole notches and unpin the pattern piece. So now our pieces are cut and we're ready to start sewing. Step 5. Assemble sleeves. Fold your sleeve piece in half with the right sides facing each other. Match the two straight edges up to meet exactly and pin into place. If you put your pins in horizontally like I'm doing here, you can leave them in on the sewing machine to make things easier. Pin the top and the bottom of the line, then match the notches and pin in the middle. Now match together the edges of the dart at the top of the sleeve and pin into place. Make sure the chalk mark we made earlier is on the edge of the fold and add another pin to hold it into place. This mark will tell us where to end our dart when we're sewing. And repeat the process for both sleeves. This part is the same for both of my blankets. Pick out your sewing thread. If you're a beginner, it's always best to use a colour that matches your project closely to hide any wobbles. We're going to start by sewing the side seams of our sleeves together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Start with a back stitch to secure the seam, then continue sewing with a straight stitch the whole way down the line. A slightly larger stitch length of about 3mm is best, as the two layers of the blanket can be quite thick. And you'll also want to increase the tension on your machine for the best stitch results. When you get to the end of the seam, finish with another back stitch. The finished result should look like this. Next, we're going to sew the dart together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance at the top, tapering down to meet our chalk mark at the end of the dart. Start with a back stitch, then sew down with a straight stitch, matching the edge of the fabric to the 1 centimetre guide until you get to the end of the split in the fabric. From here, sew in a slightly curved line towards your chalk mark, stopping when you get 1 centimetre away from the point. Then stop sewing, change your stitch length to 0.5mm and continue sewing along the very edge of the fold, right up to the chalk point. And then run off by continuing to sew without the fabric in the machine for a few centimetres after the end of the dart. And trim your threads, leaving a short tail of about 1 centimetre. The finished result should look like this up close. And to recap, as this is a skill that will come in handy for lots of projects, to sew the perfect dart, curve the stitch line towards the fold, sew the end of the dart right on the edge of the fold, change the stitch length to 0.5mm, 1 centimetre away from the chalk mark, and run your stitches off the end of the fabric to form a tail to finish. Next, we need to seal the raw edges of the two seams. I'm going to do this by using my overlocker, but if you don't have access to an overlocker or serger, sewing a large zigzag stitch along the raw edges will do exactly the same thing, stopping fraying of the fabric edges and making your coat long-lasting and durable. To finish your edges with a zigzag stitch on a regular sewing machine, set your stitch length to 2 and your stitch width to 5. Then sew right up to the raw edge of your fabric, as shown in red on the diagram. If you are using an overlocker, here's a little tip to finish the tail of the overlocking neatly. Take a large embroidery needle, insert it through the loops at the end of the overlocking, thread the tail of the overlocking through the eye of the needle, and then pull the needle through the loops, bringing the tail with it and creating a nice sealed tip. And finally, trim off any loose threads. Next, iron your seams by first ironing the area that you've just sewn flat and then pressing the seams towards the back of the sleeve. To find the back of the sleeve, look for the double notch like this. When pressing your dart, it helps to use a sleeve board, seam press or ham to get a really nice tailored shape. See how I'm pressing from the front this time, using lots of steam to stop the iron sticking and really working into the end of the dart to get it to lie nice and flat. And now the finishing touch for the sleeve is to sew across at the seam on the cuff for a neat finish. To do this, mark 2 chalk dots 1 inch up and 1/4 inch apart, and then 2 more the same just up from the cuff. These will be your guides to form the points of the cross. Starting at the bottom, sew diagonally between 2 of the points, then lower the needle into the fabric, pivot and then sew horizontally across to the next point. Pivot again, and then sew diagonally back down to the bottom to the remaining point, and finish with a backstitch. And the finished result should look like this. And you can see here how it holds the seam down into place. You should now have 2 finished sleeves that look something like this. Step 6. Assemble pockets. This step will be slightly different for the 2 blankets, so I'm going to show you both versions. For the darker one here, I'll be turning the top over at the notches towards the inside of the pocket. For the tasselled version, I'll be folding over at the notches towards the outside of the pocket to create a visible feature. And I'm also going to remove this original label, although you could choose to leave an original feature like this as part of your finished coat for an interesting detail. My first step on this pair of pockets is to seal the raw edge at the top. You can do this either with an overlocker or serger like me, or with a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Next, iron the stitches you've just sewn flat, and then fold and iron over at the notches by 1 inch, checking with your tape measure if you need to, towards the inside of the pocket, making sure to apply plenty of steam and pressure for a nice finish. Next, sew the folded edge down into place with a straight stitch 2 centimeters from the folded edge. It will look like this from the outside. Now we're going to sew a line all around the outer edge of the pocket with a straight stitch 1 centimeter from the raw edge. This will help us fold the edge of the pocket later on. And then seal the raw edge with either a zigzag stitch or on your overlocker or serger. Iron the pocket flat and then fold and iron the outer edge over by 1 centimeter using the line of straight stitches you sewed as a guide. And give the whole pocket a last press from the front. It should now look like this. The process for my second blanket is very similar, but this time I will be folding and pressing the top hem towards the outside of the pocket and keeping the tasselled edge of the blanket intact as a feature. As before, I will sew a line of straight stitch 2 centimeters from the folded edge to hold the pocket hem down into place. And then another line of straight stitch around the outside of the pocket 1 centimeter from the edge, holding the tassels out of the way where needed. I'm now going to cut off any tassels that fall outside of that 1 centimeter line and seal the raw edge as before on my overlocker, or you can use a zigzag stitch to do the same. Then press flat, fold and press over the outer edge by 1 centimeter using your line of straight stitch as a guide, so it looks like this. and give it a final press flat from the front. Step 7. Attach pockets. Open your main body piece out flat with the right side facing up towards you. These are the armholes. This is the centre back of our coat, and you should be able to see your 3 chalk dots marked on each side, which will tell us where to position our pockets. Then take your 2 pockets and mark the halfway point at the bottom of each pocket by folding in half and marking the fold with a pin. Then unfold and repeat the process for your second pocket. Now, to position them, align the top 2 corners of the pocket with the 2 dots closest to the armhole, like this, and the centre marker pin you've just placed matched to the dot at the bottom, and the same on the other side. Because we're using a reclaimed textile, it's likely your print or colourway may be asymmetrical, with contrasting pockets like I have here. So now is a good point to have a play with your positioning options to see which way you like best. When you're happy with your decision, pin your pockets into place, placing the pins at right angles to the outer edge so you can leave them in on the sewing machine. So those pockets are ready to stitch, and here's what this process looks like on my second blanket, with pockets placed like so. To sew our pockets on, we're going to use a straight stitch all the way around the outer edge of the pocket piece. Start with a back stitch in the top corner of the pocket and follow the line of the pocket all the way around, sewing just a couple of millimetres away from the edge. When you get to the end, lower your needle into the cloth. Then tuck any loose bits of seam allowance in. A wooden manicure stick is really handy for this. Pivot the piece 90 degrees, sew 5 millimetres across the top, pivot again, and sew a second line of stitches all around the outside of the pocket, 5 millimetres away from the first, using the edge of your presser foot as a guide. When you get to the end, repeat the process of tucking in your corner, pivoting the cloth 90 degrees, and end with a back stitch, meeting back at the point where you started. Finally, finish by ironing the whole pocket flat with plenty of steam and pressure. Step 8. Attach sleeves. Fold the main body piece of your coat in half as I have here. This is the left hand side of the coat, so we're going to start by identifying our left sleeve by matching up our notches. You'll find a single notch on the front of each sleeve head here, and this matches to the single notch on the front of each armhole here. On the back of the sleeve, you'll find a double notch here, which matches the double notch on the back of the armhole here. So we now know this is our left sleeve, and we're ready to pin. Start by matching the dart seam at the top of the sleeve to the single notch at the top of the armhole here. Pinch the 2 pieces together with your hand, then flip so you have the inside of the coat facing towards you, and the pieces arranged as if you're looking down the inside of the sleeve, and pin the top notch and the dart seam together. Then work your way around the sleeve hole, matching the notches and pinning as you go. The underarm seam at the bottom of the sleeve matches to the single notch at the bottom of the armhole. Now repeat the whole process on the other side with your right hand sleeve. When you have both sleeves pinned, we're going to sew them in, starting at the underarm seam of one of the sleeves, with the inside of the sleeve on top like this. Start sewing with a back stitch at the underarm seam, with a straight stitch, with a length of 3 and a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Then simply continue sewing the whole way round the armhole in a complete circle until you arrive back at the underarm seam where you started and end with a back stitch. And then finish the raw edge of the seam either with a zigzag stitch or on your overlocker or serger. And finally press the seam into shape with your iron. For the best finish, press the seam allowance inwards towards the sleeve and use plenty of steam and pressure. Step 9. Hem finishing options. Our final stage, we're going to get our coat onto our stand and have a final check of the hem before we finish it. If you don't have a stand, you can try the coat on yourself at this point instead to check the same thing. I'm just going to turn the mannequin to the sides. So if we look at the hem, you'll see that due to the nature of the blanket being a square and the way that this pattern works, you've got a slightly shorter back coming round to kind of a longer side hanging in that diamond shape. So if you like the way that looks on your particular blanket, you can leave it absolutely as is at this point and just move on to finishing the hem. However, when I make this style, I prefer to give a little bit more of a rounded look to how it swoops to the front. So rather than having that sharp angle, what I like to do is just take a little bit off that longer hanging edge there, and you can see then what that does. We've still got a slightly shorter back, but it's just a softer line as it sweeps around to the sides. And with that, you're just going by eye. You can also try the coat on and see what feels good as well. Try wrapping it around you, see which is the coziest, and then make your decision from them. So once you're happy with that position, we're just going to put a little pin in to hold that into place. And we only need to do one side because we want it to be symmetrical, so we're going to copy whatever we do on this side onto the other side, and then you can see the difference in the two styles there. And as I said, neither one is wrong or better than the other, it's just a case of personal preference, but you can see the different look that you get from those two different finishes. I'm going to show you now exactly the same thing on the shorter blanket so you can see just how it would work with a different style. So I have my second blanket coat onto the stand now. I'm in love with this one already. So you can see it was a smaller blanket and that has resulted in a shorter coat overall. If we turn it to the sides, we can see we've still got that shorter back and that longer point. In this case, I'm actually going to leave that long. I think it's going to be such a small amount we'd be taking off in this instant. I don't think it's really going to add anything to the finished garment to do that. So I'm going to finish that one just by hemming that side there. And that's important because this is a design that works with reclaimed textiles, so there isn't a one size fits all for how you're going to finish the coat at this point. What I'd say is just get creative and go with your gut, go with the way that you like it visually the most. Step 10. Remove front corners. If you have decided to remove the front corners of your coat, the first step is to measure the corner that you pinned up in the last stage and adjust so the two sides of the triangle are the same length. Re-measure to check and re-pin when you're happy. Then measure 1 inch up from the folded edge with your tape measure and mark with a dashed line of chalk. This inch will form our seam allowance for finishing. Then cut through the chalk line to remove your corner. Keep the offcut and match it up to the front corner on the other side of the coat. Then pin into place and cut alongside the raw edge of the triangle to easily create a perfectly symmetrical finish. If the pieces are large, you can put them to one side to save for another project. Step 11. Finish raw edges. The last stage of this project is to finish any raw edges we have left. Where the raw edges are will vary depending on your individual blanket, if you decided to remove the corners, and if you made use of any original features at the edges, like I did with the tassels and the blanket stitch on my two choices. So I'm going to finish that one just by hemming that side there. On this example, it's slightly different. So where we cut the blanket is the line that runs along the collar. We're going to do exactly that same finishing down the edge here. Then we're going to finish those corners that we chopped off. The back of the coat, the back hem, is actually got one of the finished edges of the blanket, so we can just leave that as is. For any raw edge, start by sewing a line of straight stitch with a stitch length of 3 and a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Next, using the line of stitches you've just sewn as a guide, fold and iron the edge towards the inside of the coat the whole way along the line, using plenty of steam and pressure. So it looks like this, and then tuck and fold a second time at the machine to form a double fold and secure into place with another straight stitch, starting with the back stitch a couple of millimetres away from the folded edge on the left, continuing to tuck and fold as you go. Then press nice and flat with your iron to get a really professional finish. When finishing the corners, if you opted for this in step 10, be careful not to stretch the edges as you sew as this part of the fabric will be cut on the bias and so have more natural give to it than the straight sides of the other edges. Also, when you're finishing the second turn on the front corners, start sewing on the very outer edge of the fabric, even though you only have a single layer there, as this will give the neatest finish from the outside of the coat. So it will look like this, and like this from the outside. If you're sewing along at home, I hope you now have a fabulous coat as well and you're feeling really proud of yourself. Please do let me know in the comments if you have any feedback, if there's anything that you think worked really well, anything you'd like to be explained in a bit more detail, let me know. I'll keep an eye on those and I'll make sure to get back to everyone. I would love to see how your coats turn out as well. So if you are sharing any photos or videos, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Sasha__Starlight. Make sure to hit like if you enjoyed this video, and I will be sharing lots more pattern and sewing videos and tutorials in the coming weeks, so please subscribe to my new channel if you'd like to be kept in the loop with that. I hope your new coat brings you all the joy, and I'll see you next time.